The entry was written in a firm, upright hand, in ink mixed a little too thin, upon the 11th page of a book bound in marbled paper and half-calf, and it ran as follows: Michaelmas week, 1819. Ground opened Monday. Frost held off 11 days longer than the year before. First flower shone on the Tuesday morning in the northwest corner, by the thorn, picked by 7 women and myself, beginning at first light, finished before the sun stood over the kiln roof. 4,000 flowers and some hundreds to the ounce, as always. Kiln lit at noon, haircloth turned twice, wind northeasterly, air clear, ground dry 1 inch down and damp beneath. Nothing lost. That was the whole of the entry, and there were 406 others like it in the same book, and 2 books before it on the shelf above the kiln stair, and the 3 of them together covered 11 years without a single week missing. The woman who had written them was 26 years of age. Her name was Lavinia Pelham, and on the morning she wrote that particular entry, she had been the owner of 3 acres of ground in the parish of Netherwenden in the county of Essex for 1 year and 7 months. Though a gentleman in Chelmsford had lately begun to write letters, saying that she was nothing of the kind. She was tall, and she stood without leaning on anything, which the parish had noticed early and had never stopped noticing. Her hair was dark honey brown, parted in the center and pinned in a twist that took her something under 2 minutes in the morning. Her eyes were gray-green and level. She had a way of listening to a whole sentence before she answered any part of it, and a way of answering exactly the question asked, and nothing beyond it, which some of her neighbors found restful, and others found maddening, and which nobody in Netherwenden had ever succeeded in altering. Her father had been the Reverend Hubert Pelham, rector of the parish for 31 years, a mild and bookish man who had loved his daughter, kept indifferent accounts, and died in the March of 1818 owing £430 to a corn factor at Bishop's Stortford, a saddler, a wine merchant, and the executors of a physician who had attended him for 2 winters. The rectory went, as rectories do, to the next incumbent. The furniture went to the sale. What did not go was a triangular piece of ground of 3 acres lying east of the church between the Ashton Road and the brook, with a low brick building at the top of it that had a tiled roof, 1 door, 1 shuttered window, and a floor of beaten earth with a hearth sunk into it. The parish called that piece of ground Croker's 3 acres. It had been called so for 120 years, and the brick building at the top of it was the kiln. In the 3rd week of every October, if the season had been kind, those 3 acres came up purple. Not lavender purple, and not the purple of a bishop's stock. It was a lilac violet of a particular clarity, thousands upon thousands of goblets no taller than a man's finger, opening all together in the cold hours before sunrise, and inside each flower 3 threads of a deep crimson orange that were worth, dried, more by weight than anything else grown between the Stort and the Colne. The flower was the autumn crocus. The threads were saffron. The men who had grown it in that corner of Essex for 200 years had been called Crokers, and one of them, a Josiah Pelham, had been granted the ground in the reign of King William, and Lavinia Pelham was his great-great-granddaughter, and she was the last of them. She was also, on the Tuesday morning after that Michaelmas entry was written, summoned to the vestry. The summons came in the ordinary way, by the hand of the curate's boy, folded and sealed with a wafer, and it desired the attendance of Miss Pelham at the vestry of the parish church of St. Botolph at 11 in the forenoon, upon a matter touching the estate of the late Reverend Hubert Pelham. It was signed by Mr. Silas Trantham, attorney, of Chelmsford, Executor. She read it standing in the doorway of the kiln, with her sleeves turned back to the elbow, and her hands and forearms stained a colour that no washing removed until December. Then she folded it, put it in the pocket of her apron, and went back to the haircloth, because there were 11 pounds weight of undried flour on the frame, and a wet day coming. And the letter would keep, and the flour would not. Mrs. Gedge, who was 70 and had picked the crop on those 3 acres since she was 9 years old, watched her from the chiving table where she sat with a heap of purple in her lap, and her red-knuckled hands moving too fast to follow. 3 threads out of each flower, and the wreck of it dropped into a basket at her feet. "Trantham," said Mrs. Gedge. "Yes, on the Tuesday. 11 o'clock, when the whole vestry sits. Yes, he might have come up the lane and said his piece at your door." "He might," said Lavinia. "Then he means it to be heard." "I suppose he does," said Lavinia, and turned the haircloth and said nothing more about it for the rest of the day. The vestry of St. Botolph's was a whitewashed room on the north side of the chancel, with 2 tall, clear windows that took the whole of the morning light and gave it back off the lime-washed walls, so that even in October it was the brightest room in the parish. There was an oak table down the middle of it with a green baize cloth, and a great parish chest under the window with 3 locks, and a row of benches against the wall for those who had business there and those who had none. By 11 o'clock on that Tuesday the benches were full. Nothing draws a parish like the affairs of a clergyman's daughter. There were the 2 churchwardens, Mr. Halstock the farmer and Mr. Preble the miller. There was Mr. Bramwell, the curate, mild 55, in a plain black cassock, with gold-rimmed spectacles that he polished when he was uneasy, and was polishing then. There was Mr. Fladbury, steward to the manor of Wendon Cray, a dry and cautious man, who took notes on the backs of old letters. There was Mrs. Tetlow, who had kept house at the rectory for 22 years, and now kept it for nobody, and who had come because she would not have missed it. There were 11 or 12 villagers who had thought of an errand near the church at that hour. There was Miss Tabitha Orsett, the schoolmistress, who had walked up from the school with ink on her 2nd finger, and sat down beside Mrs. Tetlow without being asked. And there was, at the end of the bench nearest the door, a gentleman of about 36, in a plain dark blue coat and top boots, who had ridden over from the Ashton side that morning on the business of the road bridge, and who had been asked by the curate whether he would care to sit, and had said that he would, and had then sat entirely still with his hat on his knee for the better part of an hour without saying one word to anybody. His name was Hugh Devereux, and he was the 5th Duke of Harlestone, and nobody in the room but Mr. Bramwell and the steward knew what to do with him being there, and he made no attempt to help them. Mr. Silas Trantham came in at 4 minutes past 11 with a black japanned box under his arm and a clerk behind him. He was a heavy man of about 50, pink and clean-shaven, with sandy hair combed forward over a high forehead and small pale eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly. His waistcoat was primrose yellow silk, and it was working hard. He wore a quizzing glass on a black silk ribbon, and he used it the way some men use a pause, to make a room wait. He set the box on the green baize, took out a bundle of papers tied with pink tape, untied the tape, and looked about him with the air of a man who finds a larger audience than he expected and is not sorry. Lavinia Pelham came in at 11 minutes past. She had walked up from the kiln, and she had washed to the elbow, and the stain was still on her hands. She wore a faded dove-grey gown that had been turned once and mended twice. A coarse, unbleached apron she had not taken off because she meant to go straight back, and a brown shawl with a patch at the shoulder. Her half-boots were scuffed white at the toes. She was by some distance the poorest dressed person in that room, and she came in and looked for a place on the bench and did not find one, and so she stood at the end of the table with her hands folded in front of her and waited. Mr. Trantham did not rise. "Miss Pelham," he said, "you are late." "I am," she said. The kiln was lit. "The kiln," said Mr. Trantham, and let the word sit in the room a moment, and smiled at Mr. Halstock, as though the two of them shared something. "Yes, we shall come to the kiln." He read first the account of the estate of the late Reverend Hubert Pelham, and he read it well, in a full carrying voice, item by item, the sale of the furniture, the sale of the books, the £11 got for the mare, the sums received and the sums outstanding, and the £430 that had stood against the estate at the death, and the 264 that stood against it still. It took him 19 minutes. He was not, whatever else was true of him, a careless man with a column of figures. Then he laid down that paper and took up another, and said that it became his duty as executor to speak of the residue. "There is a matter," said Mr. Trantham, "of a piece of ground." Mr. Bramwell polished his spectacles. 3 acres, said Mr. Trantham, lying east of the church between the road and the brook, together with a brick building thereon of no described value. It has been represented to me, and I do not say by whom, though the parish may guess, that this ground stands outside the estate and is the sole property of the late rector's daughter. I have looked into it. I have had 6 weeks to look into it. And I am bound to tell this vestry that I can find nothing whatever to support that representation, and a good deal to contradict it. He put up the quizzing glass and looked, for the first time, directly at Lavinia. Miss Pelham has occupied this ground since her father's death, and for some years before it. Occupation is not title. Occupation is a habit. And I will say further, since we are among neighbors and there is no sense in politeness where there is a debt to be paid, that whatever the title may prove to be, the question is very nearly an idle one, because the ground itself is worth almost nothing at all. Nobody in the room moved. "I walked it on Thursday," said Mr. Trantham. "I walked the whole of it. 3 acres of wet ground and weeds. Weeds, gentlemen. A crop of little purple weeds that the good woman has been coaxing along out of what I can only call a sentiment for her great-grandfather's trade, and a brick shed with a hole in the floor. I am told there is a kiln in it. I saw a hearth and a rag frame. I am told the crop is valuable. I have made inquiry of 2 respectable houses in London, and I am told that the article has not been grown for the market in this county within living memory, and that what is sold now comes in by way of Leghorn, and that the English sort is a curiosity." He turned back to the churchwardens. "I do not say it to wound. I say it because a parish should not encourage a young woman in an idleness. 3 acres of weeds and wet ground, a shed and a great deal of walking about with a notebook. That is the residue, and I mean to have it sold with the rest and applied to the debt, and I mean to have the standing crop taken and sold with it. because the crop follows the ground, and it is my duty to gather in every shilling that can be gathered." He set down the quizzing glass and did not trouble to lower his voice. "She has no more notion of husbandry," said Mr. Trantham, "than the crocus has of chancery." Mr. Halstock laughed. He was not an unkind man, and he was sorry for it before the sound had finished. Mr. Preble laughed, less briefly. Two of the villagers on the back bench laughed, and one of them turned round to see whether Miss Pelham had heard, which she had, because it had been said in her hearing and had been meant to be, and because she was standing 8 feet from the man who said it. Miss Orsett went scarlet to the ears. Lavinia Pelham did not weep, and she did not answer, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not look at the bench where the laughing had come from. She stood where she was with her stained hands folded, and let the room have its moment, and when the moment had gone on long enough that it had begun to be uncomfortable to the people making it, which took about 4 seconds, she said, in an ordinary voice, "One thing. May I have a copy of the account, Mr. Trantham? I will pay the clerk for it." Mr. Trantham blinked. "You may have a copy." "Thank you," she said. "Then I will not keep the vestry from its business." And she inclined her head to Mr. Bramwell and to the churchwardens, and turned and went out, and the door was shut behind her by nobody in particular, and the room sat for a moment in the bright lime-washed light, and was not quite as pleased with itself as it had been 90 seconds before. The gentleman at the end of the bench nearest the door had not moved and had not spoken. He watched her go by. When Mr. Bramwell glanced at him, a glance that was very nearly a plea, he shook his head once, slightly, and looked at the floor. Outside, the churchyard grass was wet, and the light came flat and clean across it, and the wind was north-easterly. Lavinia walked down between the graves at the same pace she always walked, and out at the like gate, and down the lane towards the kiln, and by the time she reached the stile her mind had left the vestry altogether, and had gone on to the more pressing matter, which was that Mr. Trantham had said he meant to take the standing crop, and that there were perhaps 5 days of picking left in the ground, and that the flour would not wait for the law. She had one thought as she crossed the stile, and she said it out loud to nobody, because there was nobody in the lane. "He walked it on Thursday," she said. "It rained on Thursday from noon." Then she went and turned the haircloth. To understand what Mr. Trantham had walked over on the Thursday, and why it mattered a great deal that it had rained from noon, it is necessary to go back 11 years, to a 15-year-old girl standing in a doorway and being handed a book. The Reverend Hubert Pelham had an aunt. Her name was Thomasine Pelham. She had never married. She had lived at the bottom of the same lane in the cottage at the head of Croker's 3 acres, and she had grown saffron there in the way her father and his father had grown it, which is to say badly in some years, splendidly in others, and stubbornly in all of them. She and her nephew the rector were not on bad terms, and were not on any terms at all. He thought the trade beneath a family that had produced a clergyman. She thought a man who could not tell a wet October from a dry one had no business advising anybody about anything. They spoke at Christmas and at funerals. In the June of 1808, Miss Thomasine Pelham fell ill, and being a methodical woman, she sent word up to the rectory that she would like to see the child. Lavinia was 15. She had met her great-aunt perhaps 4 times in her life, and remembered 2 of them. She was sent down the lane with a covered basket, and she was shown into a low room with a fire in it in June, and an old woman sat up in a chair with a shawl round her, and looked at her for a long time, without saying anything at all, which Lavinia, being the kind of person she was, bore without fidgeting. "You are the one that counts things," said Miss Thomasine Pelham at last. "I do not know, ma'am. Your father says you count things." He says it as though it were a complaint. "How many steps from the Lyke gate to the church porch?" 29, said Lavinia, "if you go straight. 31 the way most people go, because of the puddle." The old woman laughed until she had to stop and breathe. Then she reached beside the chair and brought out a book bound in marbled paper and half-calf, unwritten in, and a second book that was written in from end to end in a cramped brown hand, and she put them both into the girl's lap. "The full one is mine," she said. 41 years of it. Every year I have set down the day the ground was opened, the day the first flower showed, the day of the last picking, the weight got, the weather all through, and what I did wrong. The empty one is yours. You will start it this autumn, and you will not miss a week, not for illness, not for Christmas, not for a wedding. Do you know why? No, ma'am. Because the crop is not grown by hands, said Miss Thomasine Pelham. Anybody can pick a flower. The crop is grown by knowing the ground 11 years back and 11 years forward, and there is no way to know it but to write it down while you are too young to think it interesting. Every croaker that ever failed in this parish failed because he trusted his memory. Memory is a flatterer. Ink is not. She died in the September. She left the cottage and its furniture to a cousin in Braintree who sold them within the year. She left the 3 acres, the kiln, and a black japanned box to her great niece, Lavinia Pelham. And the will was proved without any trouble at all, and the rector received the papers and put the box unopened into the press in the rectory study, where it stood behind a row of bound sermons for 10 years, because he did not approve of the trade and did not wish his daughter to be encouraged in it. Lavinia was not encouraged in it. She simply did it. She began the book that October because she had been told to, and she went down the lane at first light in her oldest gown and learned the work from Mrs. Gedge and from 4 other women who had picked for her great-aunt, and she kept the 3 acres alive through the 11 years that followed with no capital, no advice, no approval from the rectory, and a set of hands that were crimson to the wrist for 2 months of every year. It is not a gentle crop. The corms must be lifted every 3rd or 4th year, and the ground rested and dressed, and they must be set again in the July at 4 inches, in ground so dry the spade rings, because the one thing the plant will not forgive is wet feet in the summer. The flower comes in the 3rd week of October, and it comes all at once, and it must be picked in the hours before the sun is on it, or the threads lose their virtue, and it must be chived the same day, and dried the same day, over a kiln at a heat that has no name and no thermometer, and must simply be known, on a haircloth turned twice, until the threads are dry enough to snap, and not so dry that they crumble. 4,000 flowers, more or less, to the ounce. 200,000 flowers, more or less, to the pound weight. A wet October costs a year. A hard frost 3 days early costs a year. A careless hour at the kiln costs the difference between an article the London houses will bid against one another for and a handful of red dust. Lavinia Pelham had lost 1 year out of 11, and she had lost it to a frost that came on the 9th of October, and she had written down why at length, in a hand that was noticeably harder on the page than usual. And this was the thing about her that nobody in the parish had ever quite put into words, though the parish had felt it. She did not merely grow saffron. She read the ground. She could walk the 3 acres in the February when there was nothing on them at all, and tell you where the wet lay and where the corms had failed, from the color of the grass over them. She could tell the frost from the smell of the air off the brook the evening before, and she had been right about the first hard frost 11 years running, which the women who picked for her had turned into a kind of parish joke, and then into a kind of parish reliance, so that Mr. Halstock, who had laughed at her in the vestry, had for 6 years past sent his boy up to Kiln Cottage in the last week of the September to ask Miss Pelham when he ought to get his roots in. She had never once said that she knew. She had always said the same sentence, "I should get them in before Thursday week." And Mr. Halstock had always got them in before Thursday week, and had never once thanked her for it, because it had never occurred to him that it was a thing that could be thanked for. That was the silent competence, and it had been sitting in the parish in plain view for 11 years, unpaid and uncounted, like a good tool left out in the rain. She lived, since her father's death, in Kiln Cottage, which was 2 rooms and a lean-to at the head of the ground and had been a drying house before it had been a cottage, and which she rented from the manor for £6 a year. Mrs. Tetlow came up twice a week and made her eat something. Miss Orsett came on Sundays and read aloud and argued about books. She had £11 a year of her own from her mother's people, and she had what the crop made, and in a good year the crop made a great deal more than £11, and in 1819 it was going to make more than it had made in any year since the war. Because that was the other thing Mr. Trantham had not troubled to learn before he stood up in the vestry. The London houses had not been able to get Spanish or Italian saffron in any quantity for 2 seasons. What came in was thin, and much of it had been helped along with safflower and marigold and a little sugar water, and the apothecaries of the city had been complaining about it in print. In the July, an agent for a house in Bucklersbury had written to Miss Pelham, having got her name from an old man in Saffron Walden who remembered the Pelhams, and had asked, with some doubt, whether there was still any English article to be had at all, and at what figure. Lavinia had answered the letter in 4 lines. She said that there would be, if the October was dry, something between 600 and 700 ounces. She said the price she wanted was 5 guineas the pound-weight, which was very high, and that she would take nothing under it, and that the article would be weighed before the buyer and might be assayed by him in any manner he pleased. She said she would not sell a single ounce unseen. The house in Bucklersbury had written back by return and agreed to the price, and had asked whether she would consider binding herself to them for 3 years. That letter was in the japanned box, which was no longer in the rectory press. She had got the box in the April after her father died, when the new incumbent's people were clearing the study, and Mrs. Tetlow, who missed nothing, had carried it up the lane under her apron, and set it on the table at Kiln Cottage and said, "That is yours, and has been these 10 years, and I have said so before now, and been told to mind my place." Lavinia had opened it that evening. There were 9 things in it. There was her great-aunt's full register, the 41 years, in the cramped brown hand. There were letters, There was a memorandum of the corms bought in 1784 and where they came from. There was a rent receipt for 1 ounce of saffron, dated Michaelmas, and another, and another, and another, 31 of them, each on a slip of paper no bigger than a hand, each signed by a different steward of the manor of Wendon Cray, going back to before her great-aunt was born, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of unbleached linen, folded twice, with a seal of red wax the size of a crown piece hanging from it on a strip of the same skin, there was a sheet of vellum. It was written in a court hand that took Lavinia 2 evenings and a magnifying glass to read through, and it was dated in the 10th year of the reign of King William III, in the year of our Lord 1698, and it was a grant. By it, Sir Everard Cray, Knight, Lord of the Manor of Wendon Cray in the county of Essex, in consideration of the sum of £40 paid to him, granted and confirmed unto Josiah Pelham of the same parish, Croker, and to his heirs and assigns for ever, all that close of pasture and arable containing by estimation 3 acres called Croker's 3 acres, lying between the King's highway and the brook, together with the drying house lately built thereon, and the way to the same from the said highway, to be held of the said manor freely and for ever, yielding and paying therefore yearly at the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel 1 ounce of good, dried saffron of the growth of the said close, the same to be weighed at the manor beam in the presence of the reeve and the constable of the said parish, and there entered in the roll of the manor in the name of the tenant. Lavinia read it twice, and then she read the 31 rent receipts, and then she sat for some time with her hands flat on the table. There is a particular quiet that comes over a person who has been told all her life that a thing is a habit and discovers that it is a right. She did not go up to the village and tell anybody. She did not write to a newspaper. What she did on the following Monday was walk 2 miles to the manor house at Wendon Cray and ask Mr. Fladbury the steward whether the court rolls of the manor were kept there or at Chelmsford, and whether a tenant might see her own entry. Mr. Fladbury, who had been steward for 9 years and had never been asked such a question by anybody under 60, said that they were kept there, in the muniment room, and that a tenant might see her own entry on giving reasonable notice, and asked, with the caution of a man who does not wish to be caught out, what entry she meant. Croker's 3 acres, said Lavinia, the Michaelmas ounce. I should like to see that it has been entered every year, and I should like to know who entered it. It took Mr. Fladbury 3 weeks and a good deal of dust. When he had finished, he came up the lane himself, which was not a thing stewards did, and stood in the doorway of Kiln Cottage with his hat in his hand and a folded sheet of paper covered in his own small writing. Every year, he said, since 1698. There are 4 gaps, 1745, 1746, and 1799, when the crop failed, and the ounce was excused in the roll by the steward's own hand, and 1809, which is entered but not signed. 117 entries, in all, in 11 different hands, and the last 11 of them are in mine, and I have been signing them for you since you were 16 years old, and never once looked to see what I was signing. He held out the paper. Miss Pelham, he said, you own that ground the way the king owns Windsor. What in the name of goodness has the Executor been writing me letters about? What the Executor had been writing letters about was, in the plainest terms, £430 and a reputation. Mr. Silas Trantham had come to Chelmsford from a small practice at Maldon 11 years before, and had built himself up on executorships. It is not a glamorous branch of the profession, and it is a very steady one, and a man who gets the name of being thorough with a dead man's affairs will never want for work. He had been given the Reverend Hubert Pelham's papers by the rector's own hand 3 weeks before the rector died, and he had found them in a state that made him whistle, and he had spent 18 months since gathering in what could be gathered, and he had gathered in every shilling but 264 of them. £264 is not a fortune, but an executor who closes an estate at a loss carries that loss on his name in a county where names are the whole of a man's capital. And Mr. Trantham had been asked twice already by the corn factor at Bishop Stortford when he might expect to be paid, and had been asked the second time in a room with other people in it. So he had looked about him for anything left, and he had found the 3 acres, and he had made a claim. He had made it at first in the way such claims are usually made, by letter, and the letters had been civil and had grown less civil. He had written to Miss Pelham in the June, saying that the ground appeared to form part of the residue. She had written back in one sentence saying that it did not, and that her title was of record at the manor. He had written in the July, asking her to produce her title. She had written back saying that she would produce it before the parish, at the vestry, at any hour convenient to the vestry, and would produce it nowhere else. That answer had annoyed him more than a rude one would have done, and it was the reason he had appointed 11 o'clock on a Tuesday when the whole vestry sat, and had come with a box under his arm and a clerk behind him, and had said what he said about weeds in a room with 26 people in it. He had intended, when he stood up, to make it impossible for her to be stubborn. A woman of 26, alone, laughed at once in front of her neighbours, generally gives way within the week. He had made 2 errors, and neither of them was in his figures. The first was that he had never once, in 18 months, gone to the manor and asked to see the roll, because he had been told by the late rector himself, in a letter written in the year 1811, which Mr. Trantham had in his own hand, that my aunt's ground below the church is a leasehold of the manor, and will fall in at her death. The rector had believed that. The rector had believed it because he had never asked either. Mr. Trantham had built 18 months of work upon a dead clergyman's guess, and had never tested it, and the whole of his difficulty proceeded from that one omission. The second error was that he thought the crop was worth nothing. On the Thursday of that week, the Thursday after the vestry, not the Thursday he had claimed to have walked the ground, Mr. Trantham came to Nether Wendon with his clerk, a hired cart, 4 men from Chelmsford, and a paper. The paper was a notice by which the executor took possession of the residue of the estate pending sale, and it named the close, the drying house, and all crops standing, cut, gathered or stored thereon. It was, considered simply as a document, quite properly drawn. He served it at 8:30 in the morning at the door of Kiln Cottage, and Lavinia Pelham read it standing on her own step in her working gown with her hair already pinned for the day, and handed it back and said, "You will want a copy signed. I will sign it. You will not resist." "I will not resist you," she said. "I shall write down what you take." And she did. She went and got the book, and she stood at the corner of the kiln, out of the way, and she wrote down everything in the same firm, upright hand, while 4 men from Chelmsford carried out of the drying house the whole of the year's make. It was in canisters of tinned iron, of the sort that tea comes in, each holding about 1 pound weight, packed with paper, sealed with a wafer, and marked on the lid, not with a number, for she never used a number where a date would do, but with the day of the picking. There were 40 of them, less a little. There was, besides, the flour of that morning and the 2 mornings before, not yet dried, on the haircloth, some 11 pounds weight of wet stuff that would come to something over 3 ounces when the kiln had done with it. And the men took the haircloth too, frame and all, and put it in the cart, and one of them said that it looked like a mess of weeds to him. And Mrs. Gedge, sitting at the chiving table with her hands still going, told him what she thought of his eyesight in language that Miss Orsett afterwards refused to repeat to the school children. Lavinia wrote down the canisters by their dates. She wrote down the frame. She wrote down the hour, which was 20 minutes past 9, and the weather, which was fair with a north wind, because she had never in 11 years written an entry without the weather in it, and she was not going to begin. Then she looked at the last line, and she did a thing she had done at the end of every October since she was 15. She added the year's weights together, out of her own book, and set the total at the foot of the page. 640 ounces. She wrote it in words. Then she wrote, underneath, taken this day by Mr. Silas Trantham, attorney of Chelmsford, executor of my father, and to be weighed. You will have that back, said Mr. Trantham from the cart, not unkindly, because he was not a cruel man so much as a frightened one, when the court has said whose it is. If it proves yours, you shall have every ounce. If it proves the estate's, it will pay a good part of a debt that your father left, and that somebody must pay. Yes, said Lavinia. You do not seem angry. I am extremely angry, she said. It does not help the flour. He looked at her for a moment, and something crossed his pink face that might have been the beginning of a doubt, and then the horse moved and the cart went down the lane, and the executor went with it, and the 3 acres lay behind him, half-picked in the flat autumn light, with perhaps 5,000 flowers still out, and nobody to take them. Mrs. Gedge got up from the chiving table. Well, she said, are we picking, or are we standing about? We are picking, said Lavinia. He has taken the frame. There is the old frame in the loft, said Lavinia. It wants 2 laths. Mr. Locke will cut them. They picked the ground out over the next 4 days, 7 women and 1 girl of 19 from the school, beginning at first light in a cold that made the hands ache. And they chived at the table until the light went, and they dried on a frame patched with 2 laths of green ash, and Lavinia sat up 2 nights at the kiln, and lost nothing. The make of those 4 days came to 11 ounces and a half. She sealed them in the last 3 canisters, wrote the dates on the lids, and put them under the floor of the lean-to. Not because she thought Mr. Trantham would come back. He had taken what his notice named and would not exceed it, whatever else he was, but because she had begun, in a way she did not much like in herself, to think ahead. On the Monday she walked to Bishop Stortford, which is 9 miles, and back, which is 9 more, and she did it in a day. And she came back with a letter of engagement from Mr. Penlow. Mr. Penlow was 65, and had been an attorney at Bishop's Stortford for 39 years, and was thin and upright, and wore gold-rimmed spectacles and a plain black coat, and he had known her mother's family. He heard her out for an hour and a quarter without interrupting, which nobody had done for her since her great-aunt, and at the end of it he took off his spectacles and polished them on a handkerchief and put them back on. "Miss Pelham," he said, "have you the deed itself, or a copy? The grant is in my keeping. It has a seal, and the manor roll is entered 117 times. Mr. Fladbury has abstracted it, and will swear to it. And the rent receipts? 31. In the box." Mr. Penlow sat back. "Then, forgive me, why am I engaged? You could take this to any attorney in Essex, and he would write one letter, and Mr. Trantham would have to give way, and it would be finished in a fortnight in the ordinary way of business, and nobody would ever hear of it but the two of you." "That is why," said Lavinia. "I do not follow." She looked at the fire for a moment. It was the only time in the whole affair that anybody saw her take a moment. "He said what he said in the vestry," she said. "He said it before the churchwardens, and the curate and the steward and 11 of my neighbours, and the woman who kept my father's house." Mr. Halstock laughed. "I have told Mr. Halstock when to get his roots in for 6 years. If this is settled by a letter between 2 attorneys, then in 5 years' time what the parish will remember is that there was some trouble about Miss Pelham's ground and it was hushed up, and that the man from Chelmsford said it was weeds. I do not want a letter, Mr. Penlow. I want it read out. In the vestry. In the vestry, where it was said." Mr. Penlow was quiet for a while. "You understand," he said, "that I must advise you against it. It costs more. It takes longer. It exposes you to being contradicted in public, and a public room is not a court, and there is no judge in it to keep order. And there is a particular danger, which I will name plainly, that a young woman who insists upon a public vindication is very often afterwards spoken of as a young woman who insists." "Yes," said Lavinia, "you have considered it. I have considered it since Tuesday week, and I have not thought of much else." "Then that is my advice given," said Mr. Penlow, "and I am now free to enjoy myself, which at my age is a thing that happens about twice in a decade. We shall do it in the vestry." He drew the notice that afternoon. It was addressed to the Executor and copied to the churchwardens and to the steward of the manor, and it required Mr. Silas Trantham to attend at the vestry of St. Botolph, Nether Wendon, on the 9th day of November at 11 in the forenoon, to hear read the title of the said close called Croker's 3 Acres, and to bring with him the whole of the crop taken by him on the 21st of October, entire and unsold, that the same might be weighed at the manor beam, according to the tenor of the grant, in the presence of the reeve and the constable of the parish, as had been done at Michaelmas in every year since the reign of King William. Mr. Penlow read that last clause over twice after he had written it, and laughed out loud. "Do you know what you have got here, Miss Pelham?" he said. "You have got a rent clause 121 years old that specifies where the crop of that close is to be weighed, and who is to stand by while it happens. Nobody has looked at it in a century because nobody had any occasion to. It is not a curiosity. It is a right annexed to the land, and it runs with the land, and it is yours. And the beautiful part, the part I shall be thinking about on my deathbed, is that the man who has your crop in his strong room cannot obey it without carrying every canister out into the daylight in front of the parish, and putting it on the scale with his own hands." The notice went out from Bishop Stortford on the 22nd, and by the Friday every soul in Nether Wendon knew that Miss Pelham had had the whole of her crop carried off in a cart, and was not apparently going to cry about it, and that there was to be a meeting in the vestry on the 9th of November, at which something was to be read. A parish handles that sort of information the way a kiln handles wet flour. It turns it, and turns it again. The first version, which lasted about 2 days, was that the poor young lady had lost everything and would have to go for a governess. Mrs. Tetlow put an end to that one personally, in the shop at some length. The second version, which lasted a week and was much enjoyed, was that Miss Pelham had a paper from the time of Queen Anne with the King's own seal upon it, and was going to have the attorney committed to prison. Miss Orsett put an end to that one in the schoolroom by explaining to 9 children what a seal actually was, which is why 4 families in the parish spent the last week of October discussing the difference between a grant and a lease at their own tables. The third version, which settled in and stayed, was the true one, and it was carried about mostly by Mr. Fladbury, the steward, who had spent 9 years being a dry and cautious man, and had discovered, at the age of 8 and 40, the enormous pleasure of being the one person in a parish who has actually read the documents. There was, underneath the talk, a colder current, and Lavinia felt it, and did not pretend she did not. Not everybody was on her side. There were 2 or 3 in that village who had been quite comfortable with a rector's daughter, who worked in an apron so long as she was poor, and who found something less comfortable in a rector's daughter who was about to be proved right in public against a gentleman from Chelmsford. It was said in one kitchen that a young woman who goes to law is a young woman nobody will have. It was said in another that if she had only asked, the thing might have been managed quietly, and that all this business with beams and constables was a great deal of show. Mrs. Gedge reported both of these to her at the chiving table, word for word, without softening either, because she was 70, and had stopped softening things in about the year 1790. "And what do you say to it?" said Lavinia. "I say," said Mrs. Gedge, "that I have picked on this ground for a woman that is dead and a woman that is living, and that neither of them ever once asked me to say a word for her, and that I have been waiting 61 years for somebody to make a man from a town carry something." The 4 days after the seizure were the hardest work of Lavinia Pelham's life to that date, and the account of them in the register is the longest entry in the book, because the drying house had been stripped of the frame, and the flour was coming, and the flour does not care. It comes up in the dark, all together, and it opens with the first light, whether there is a haircloth in the parish or not. Mr. Locke, the bailiff at Halstock's, came up the lane on the Thursday evening, without being sent for, with 2 laths of green ash on his shoulder and a bag of nails, and mended the old frame from the loft by lantern light in the doorway, while Mrs. Tetlow held the lantern and told him he was doing it wrong. They picked from before dawn until the sun stood over the kiln roof, 7 women, a girl of 19, and the mistress of the ground. They chived from 10 until the light went, at a table under the window with the shutter propped, 3 threads out of every flower, the crimson-orange stigmas into the shallow basket, and the ruined purple into the pail. They lit the kiln at noon each day, and Lavinia sat with it. And she sat up with it on the second night, and the third night, because a patched frame does not lie flat, and a frame that does not lie flat dries unevenly, and the difference between saffron and red dust is, as she had told the man from Bucklersbury a year later, always the last half hour. Miss Orsett came up on the Saturday and, having no skill whatever, was given the pail and told to carry, and carried, and had blisters and was extremely proud of them. The make of those 4 days was 11 ounces and a half. It was, in weight, less than a 50th of what was standing in a strong room in Chelmsford. In every other way, it was the answer to the whole affair, and both women knew it while they were doing it, and neither of them said so, because there was no need. On the Sunday, Lavinia wrote to the house in Bucklersbury. She told them plainly that the crop had been taken under a notice by the executor of her late father's estate, that she disputed the claim and expected to establish her title on the 9th of November, that the article was entire and unsold and in canisters and in her opinion in no danger, that she would not ask them to hold their money, and they were free to buy elsewhere, and that if they chose to wait, she would be obliged to them, and would not raise the price by a shilling on account of their patience. The house in Bucklersbury replied on the 28th in 11 lines. They said that they had bought the article for 22 years, and had never before had a letter from a grower that told them the bad news first. They said that they would wait until Christmas. They said that if the 9th of November went against her, they would still take the 11 ounces and a half at the agreed figure, which was a piece of generosity so exactly calculated to insult nobody that Lavinia read it out to Mrs. Tetlow twice. Mr. Penlow came over from Bishop Stortford on the 2nd of November and spent a day and a half at Kiln Cottage with the japanned box open on the table and Mrs. Tetlow feeding him at intervals. He went through it as an old attorney goes through a thing, which is to say, he spent most of the time looking for the hole. He read the grant 4 times and held the seal up to the window. He read the 31 rent receipts and put 3 of them aside because the hands were the same and the dates were 9 years apart, and then found the explanation in the roll and put them back. He read Miss Thomasine Pelham's will, and the probate, and the memorandum of the corms, and the 11 years of the register, and he asked 140 questions, and wrote the answers on the backs of old letters in a hand nobody but himself could read. "There is no hole," he said at the end of it. "There is one soft place, and it is not in your title. It is in the crop." Trantham took it under a notice properly drawn, believing himself entitled. He has not sold it, he has not opened it, he has not concealed it. If he had been a rogue, we should have had him easily. Because he is only a fool in a hurry, the law will simply hand it back and think no more about it, and there will be no damages and no costs worth having and no finding of any kind against him. Do you understand what I am telling you? "You are telling me," said Lavinia, "that if I want anything more than my canisters back, I shall have to take it out of him in the churchyard rather than in a court." "I am telling you," said Mr. Penlow, "that I am 65 and have never once in my professional life advised a client to do anything of the kind, and that I have now read that rent clause 11 times. And that in my considered opinion it is not spite. It is the oldest lawful way there is of establishing in the memory of a village whose crop a crop is. They did it that way for 120 years because there were no newspapers and no registers of title, and half the parish could not read. They stood a scale outside the church door and made everybody watch. There is nothing in this world so hard to argue with afterwards as 40 people who saw the arm come to rest. He put his spectacles back on. Whether it is kind is another question, and it is yours and not mine. Lavinia thought about that for 2 days and 1 night. She wrote in the register, on the 4th of November, under the weather which was overcast, wind southwest, ground wet 2 inches, I have asked myself whether I am doing this to be safe or to be admired, and I am not perfectly sure of the answer, and I am going to do it anyway, and I shall write down here that I was not sure, so that I cannot afterwards tell myself that I was. As for Mr. Silas Trantham, his 18 days went as follows, and most of it did not come out until years afterwards, when his clerk had a practice of his own at Braintree, and told the story at a dinner. He received the notice on the 23rd. He read the requirement about the manor beam and the reeve and the constable, and did not at first believe that it was a real clause, and sent his clerk to the Rolls office at Chelmsford to find out whether such a thing could run with land, and got an answer he did not like. He wrote 3 letters to Miss Pelham's attorney and tore up all 3. He looked again at the letter of the late rectors of the year 1811, upon which he had built 18 months of work, and read it a 4th time, and saw at last that the words my aunt's ground below the church is a leasehold of the manor were not a statement of title at all, but a mild old man's guess about his own family, and that he, a professional man of 11 years standing in the county, had never once asked to see the roll. On the 2nd of November, he rode to Wendon Cray and asked. Mr. Fladbury, who might have made it very unpleasant and did not, showed him the roll for 2 hours in the muniment room with the strap off and the wooden boards flat on the table, and answered every question exactly, and offered him a chair when he stopped asking them. At the end of it, Mr. Trantham said, 117 entries. 117. And it did not occur to you, in 18 months of my letters, to tell me? It occurred to me on the first day, said Mr. Fladbury. I wrote it to you in the July. You will find my letter in your own bundle, sir, if you look, under the 2nd of July, and I am sorry to say that you did not answer it, and I concluded that you knew your business. Mr. Silas Trantham rode back to Chelmsford in the dark, and according to his clerk, said nothing at all for the whole 11 miles, and then said at his own door 1 sentence. I have called a woman a fool in front of her neighbours, he said, for knowing a thing I could have known by riding 2 miles. He came, all the same, on the 9th, and he brought the crop. There were 19 days between the drawing of that notice and the 9th of November, and it is necessary to say something in them about the gentleman who had sat at the end of the bench nearest the door and had not opened his mouth. The 5th Duke of Harlestone had come into Essex in the March upon a piece of business so unromantic that the parish had taken 3 months to believe it. The bridge that carried the Ashton Road over the brook had been condemned by the Surveyor of Highways in the January, and the cost of rebuilding it fell partly upon the parish, which had £31 in hand, and partly upon the estate that owned the land at the northern end, which was one of the smaller properties of the Harlestone family, and had been let to a tenant for 40 years and forgotten. The Duke, who had come into the title at 29, and had spent the 7 years since going over his own affairs 1 property at a time with the doggedness of a man who has discovered that his father's agents were fond of him, came to look at the bridge himself. He was 36. He was tall and lean and rode everywhere, and his face had the weathering of a man who was out in all seasons, and he dressed so plainly that Mr. Halstock, meeting him at the ford, had taken him for somebody's land agent and told him so, and had been told in return that it was the pleasantest thing anybody had said to him that year. He was unmarried. He was very grave, and he had a slow voice, and he did not fill a silence merely because it had appeared. He first spoke to Lavinia Pelham on the 14th of April, at the brook, where she was on her knees in the grass with a thermometer in the ground and a book open on a flat stone beside her, and where he had stopped his horse because a woman kneeling in wet grass with a thermometer is not a thing a man rides past. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Is somebody ill?" "No," said Lavinia, without looking up. "The ground is." "Ah," he said, and got down off the horse. She told him, because he had asked, and because she answered questions exactly, that she was taking the ground temperature at 4 inches at the same 6 places she took it in the 2nd week of every month, and that the 2 places nearest the brook had run 3 degrees warm all winter, and were therefore going to be the first to fail, and that she wanted to know by how much before she lifted the corms in the July, because there is no sense in setting good corms into ground that has told you it will drown them. The Duke of Harlestone asked what the 6 places were, and she showed him, and he asked how long she had been doing it, and she said since she was 15. He asked whether she had the earlier years by her. She said she had 11 years of her own and 41 of her great-aunts. He said after a moment that he had 400 and some tenants, and had been trying since the Michaelmas before last to get any one of them to write down anything at all, and that he had never in his life met a person who had 52 years of the same 3 acres, and that he did not think there were 50 such books in England. "There are not," said Lavinia. "There are perhaps 9. I have written to 6 of them." He came back in the May, and in the June on the business of the bridge and other business that got thinner each time, and in the last week of the June, standing at the gate of Croker's 3 acres with his hat in his hand, he asked her to marry him. He did it badly. He said afterwards that he had done it badly, and he was right. He had intended to wait until the autumn, and he had not managed it, and what he said had a good deal in it about the register, and not enough about her, and she heard him out to the end without moving. Then she said no. "May I ask why?" "Because you have known me 11 weeks, said Lavinia, "and because in 3 of those weeks you have been in London, and because a man of your rank who asks a woman of mine in June has generally asked because he is lonely in a strange county, and has been reading too much into the first sensible conversation he has had in it. And because I have an October coming, and I cannot think about anything else until it is over, and I will not give an answer I have not thought about. That is 4 reasons. You asked for one. You may have the rest at Michaelmas if you still want them." The Duke of Harlestone put his hat on. "Then I shall ask again after your October," he said, "and I shall not ask in between, and I shall not hang about the lane, and if the answer is no again, it will be the last time, and I shall not make it awkward for you in the parish. Have I got that right?" "You have got it exactly right." "Miss Pelham," he said, "you are the only person I have met since I came into the title who has told me a plain no without looking at my boots first." And he got on his horse and rode away, and he did not come up the lane again until the September. and when he did, he talked about the bridge. That was where the matter stood, when Mr. Silas Trantham stood up in the vestry on the Tuesday and said what he said about weeds and about Chancery. The Duke of Harlestone was in the room. He heard all of it. He was, by every measure the world uses, the one person present who could have ended it with a sentence. And the curate looked at him, and the steward looked at him, and he shook his head once, and looked at the floor, and let her walk out. He came to Kiln Cottage that evening. He did not come in. He stood at the door and said, "I want to be sure I have understood you. In June you told me you would not have my help with your October. Did that include this?" "It included everything," said Lavinia. "Then I will tell you what I have done, and you may be angry with me if you choose. When Mr. Bramwell asked me in the churchyard whether I would speak to Trantham, I said that I would not. I said it because you had told me you would not have it, and because a word from me would have settled it in an afternoon, and nobody in that parish would ever again have been able to tell the difference between your ground being yours and my saying that it was. I have never in my life wanted so much to say something and not said it. I would like you to know it cost me a good deal. And I would like you to know that I am not asking to be thanked for it, because a man who does what he is asked and then presents the bill has not done it at all." "Thank you," said Lavinia. "I said I was not asking." "You were not," she said. "I am giving." He was silent a moment. "May I come on the 9th, he said, as one of the parish?" "At the back. I will not say a word." "You may come," said Lavinia, "if you will do one thing for me. Name it. Stand where they can all see you," she said, "and say nothing at all the whole time, whatever happens. I want it settled by the paper, and I want 30 people to have watched a duke sit through it with his hands in his lap." "That," said the Duke of Harlestone, "is the coldest-blooded thing anybody has ever asked me to do, and I shall enjoy it very much." The 9th of November was a Tuesday, and it came up cold and bright with a hard blue sky and a white sun, and by 10 o'clock there were more people in the churchyard of St. Botolph than there had been at the harvest. Word had gone about, as word does. Mr. Fladbury had told the manor. Mrs. Tetlow had told the village, at length, with additions. Miss Orsett had shut the school for the day on the ground that the children would learn more in the vestry than out of it, which was the only genuinely improper thing done by anybody in the whole business, and which she never once regretted. Mrs. Gedge came up the lane at 9:30 in a bonnet nobody had seen since the peace, with 5 of the pickers behind her, and took the front bench and dared anybody to want it. By 11 the vestry held 41 people, and the door stood open with more in the passage. The green baize table had been cleared. On it, at one end, lay the black japanned box. Beside it stood Mr. Penlow with his spectacles on and his hands behind his back. Behind him sat Mr. Fladbury with the manor roll of Wendon Cray on his knees, a book 2 feet long bound in wooden boards and vellum, with a strap round it. Mr. Bramwell had put himself at the head of the table, because somebody had to, and had polished his spectacles 4 times. Mr. Halstock and Mr. Preble sat where churchwardens sit. The constable of the parish, a wheelwright named Job Curtis, stood at the door with his staff, having been sent for in form, and being extremely pleased about it. And at the back, on the end of the bench nearest the door, with his hat on his knee and his hands in his lap, sat a tall, lean gentleman in a plain dark blue coat who did not speak to anybody, and at whom, over the following 2 hours, every single person in that room looked at least once. Mr. Silas Trantham arrived at 3 minutes to 11 with his clerk, and with a carrier's cart behind him under a tarpaulin, and he was not smiling. He had had the notice for 18 days. He had, in that time, done the one thing that might have saved him, which was to go at last to the manor and ask to see the roll, and Mr. Fladbury had shown it to him, all 117 entries of it, and had watched an attorney of 50 read down a column of his own predecessor's handwriting, and go the colour of the vellum. He had come, nevertheless, that must be said for him. He might have written a letter conceding everything and stayed in Chelmsford, and 3/4 of the men in his profession would have. He came, and he brought the crop, entire and unsold, under a tarpaulin, because the notice had required it, and because he was, in the one part of himself that had never been for sale, a thorough man. Lavinia Pelham came in at 11 exactly. She had not put on anything better. That had been discussed at some length in the cottage the evening before, Mrs. Tetlow being strongly of the opinion that a person ought to be dressed for her own vindication, and Miss Orsett offering a bombazine of her mother's, and Lavinia had thanked them both, and had worn the mended dove grey gown and the shawl with the patch and her working half-boots, and had come in with her hands still faintly stained at the knuckles, because it was the 9th of November and the stain does not go until December. There was no bench for her again. This time Mrs. Gedge got up off the front bench without a word, and stood, and 11 other people stood, and Lavinia said, "Sit down, Mrs. Gedge, I am going to be standing anyway." And Mrs. Gedge sat down, and something went round that room that had not been in it 3 weeks before. Mr. Bramwell cleared his throat, and said that the vestry was met, not as a court, for it was no court, but upon the requisition of Miss Pelham's attorney, to hear read the title of a piece of ground in the parish, and that the churchwardens, the steward of the manor and the constable were present as witnesses, and that he would ask everybody to be silent, and that he hoped they would all remember they were in the church. Then he sat down and said, "Mr. Penloway." And Mr. Penloway of Bishop Stortford, 65 years old and 39 of them at the same desk, took off the strap, opened the japanned box, lifted out a folded piece of linen, unwrapped a sheet of vellum with a red seal the size of a crown piece hanging from it, laid it on the green baize where the whole room could see the seal, and read it aloud. He read it in the flat, unhurried voice attorney's use for instruments, which is the least dramatic voice in England, and which, for that reason, is very hard to interrupt. He read the date, in the 10th year of the reign of King William III, in the year of our Lord 1698. He read the name of Sir Everard Cray, Knight, Lord of the Manor of Wendon Cray. He read the consideration, £40. He read the name of Josiah Pelham of the same parish, Croker, and his heirs and assigns for ever. He read the description of the close, 3 acres by estimation, called Croker's 3 acres, lying between the King's Highway and the brook, with the drying house lately built thereon and the way to the same. He read the words freely and forever, and then he read the rent. Yielding and paying therefore yearly at the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, said Mr. Penloway, 1 ounce of good dried saffron of the growth of the said close, the same to be weighed at the manor beam in the presence of the reeve and the constable of the said parish, and there entered in the roll of the manor in the name of the tenant. He laid the vellum down. Mr. Fladbury, he said. The steward of the manor of Wendon Cray got up with the roll on his arm, and it took 2 men to hold it open on the green baize, and he went down it with his finger. He read out the entry for 1699. He read the entry for 1700. He read 1701. Then he said that he would not read the whole of them out because they would be there until dark, and that he had abstracted them, and that the abstract was in his hand and he would swear to it, and that the substance of it was this: that the ounce of saffron had been rendered and weighed and entered in the name of a Pelham at Michaelmas in every year but 4 since the grant. That the 4 exceptions were years of crop failure excused in the roll by the steward's own hand, that there were 117 entries in 11 different hands, and that the last 11 of them were in his. And the last of all, said Mr. Penlow. The last of all, said Mr. Fladbury, is Michaelmas last, 6 weeks ago. 1 ounce, good, dry, weighed by me at the beam in the yard at Wendon Cray, in the presence of the constable here present, and entered in the roll in the name of Lavinia Pelham, spinster of this parish. She brought it herself. She walks it over. She has walked it over every year since she was 16, and I have never once had to send for it. The room made a noise. It was not a cheer. It was the noise 40 people make when they all move slightly at the same moment. Mr. Penlow let it die. There are, besides, he said, 31 receipts for that rent in the box, in 31 hands. There is the will of Miss Thomasine Pelham, proved in the year 1808, which devises the clothes to her great niece by name. There is the memorandum of the Corms bought in 1784, and there is, gentlemen, no lease, no agreement, no surrender, no note, no memorandum, and no scrap of paper anywhere in the muniment room of that manor, or in the box on this table, which has ever, in 121 years, described this close as a leasehold of anything. He turned round. Mr. Trantham, you have heard the grant read, and you have seen the roll. Do you contest the title? There was a silence in that whitewashed room of a length that people afterwards disagreed about. Miss Orsett said it was half a minute. Mr. Bramwell said it was 10 seconds and felt like a fortnight. Mr. Silas Trantham stood up. He was a heavy man, and he stood up slowly, and his primrose waistcoat was the brightest thing in a very bright room, and his pink face had gone a curious mottled colour, and he did not put up the quizzing glass, and he never used it again in that parish. I do not contest the title, he said. He said it clearly. He deserves that much. I withdraw the claim of the estate to the close called Croker's 3 acres, to the drying house upon it, and to the way to it, and I acknowledge the same to be the freehold of Miss Lavinia Pelham, held of the manor of Wendon Cray by the rent stated, and I shall so certify to the court in my account. The notice I served upon the 21st of October was served in error. The error was mine. It proceeded from a letter of the late rector's, written in 1811, in which he described the ground as a leasehold that would fall in at his aunt's death, and I acted upon that letter for 18 months, and never went to the manor to test it, and if I had walked 2 miles at any time in those 18 months, there would have been no notice, no cart, and no meeting here today. He stopped. He looked, for the first time that morning, at the young woman standing at the end of the table in the mended grey gown. I said in this room 3 weeks ago that the ground was 3 acres of weeds and wet ground. I said it in Miss Pelham's hearing, and I said it to raise a laugh, and I got one. I have since walked that close in company with Mr. Fladbury, in the dry, and I am obliged to say that there is not a wet rood in it. The wet I saw on the Thursday was in the lane and on the headland by the brook, and a man who cannot tell a lane from a close has no business telling a parish what a close is worth. Nobody laughed. Mr. Halstock was looking very hard at his own hands. "That is the title," said Mr. Penloe. "Now the crop." And here the thing became what the parish talks about still, because a lesser attorney than Mr. Penloe would have taken the withdrawal, shaken hands, sent the canisters up the lane in a cart, and gone home to dinner. And Mr. Penloe said, "Mr. Bramwell, with the leave of the vestry, and the constable being present, I shall ask that the crop taken on the 21st of October be now restored in the manner the grant provides. The grant says the crop of this close is weighed at the manor beam, before the reeve and the constable. Mr. Fladbury has had the beam brought down this morning, and it is standing outside the south door. Mr. Trantham has brought the crop. It is my client's wish that it be weighed there and now and entered." "Is it necessary?" said Mr. Bramwell unhappily, who was a kind man and could see what was being done. "It is not necessary," said Mr. Penloe. "It is her right." Everybody looked at Lavinia Pelham. She had not spoken since she came in. She spoke now, and she spoke to Mr. Trantham directly, which she had not done once in the whole affair. "Sir," she said, "you took 40 canisters and a frame out of my drying house in front of 7 women who work for me, and you did it under a paper, and you were within your rights as you understood them, and I have never said otherwise, and I do not say it now, but the paper is answered, and the canisters are in your cart. I could have them carried up the lane by a boy, and nobody would ever see them again, and in 10 years the parish would remember the word weeds, and nothing else at all. I want them weighed. I want them weighed where the grant says, and entered where the grant says, and I want it done today, while these people are standing here. That is all I want. I do not want your money, I do not want an apology written out, and I do not want you spoken ill of in Chelmsford. And if anybody in this room repeats today's business in Chelmsford, they will hear from me about it." Mr. Trantham stood with his hands at his sides. "Who is to lift them?" he said. "You took them," said Lavinia. "You may bring them." And Mr. Silas Trantham, attorney, of Chelmsford, executor, 50 years old, in a primrose silk waistcoat, went out of the vestry door into the churchyard of St. Botolph in the cold white sunshine, and pulled the tarpaulin off a carrier's cart, and carried the crop of Croker's 3 acres to the manor beam, with his own hands, 1 canister at a time, in front of 41 people, 40 times. The beam had been brought down from Wendon Cray on a handcart, a great old scale of polished brass and iron on a trestle, the 2 pans the size of dinner plates, the arm as long as a man's leg, with the manor's weights in a wooden case, the pound and the half-pound and the quarter and the ounces down to a quarter ounce, all of them stamped, and none of them younger than the beam. Mr. Fladbury set it up on the flat stone by the south door, tried it empty, and pronounced it true. The constable stood at his elbow with the staff. Miss Orsett had a sheet of paper on the churchyard wall and a pencil, having appointed herself clerk, and nobody argued. Then they waited. The first canister went on, and Mr. Fladbury called it, and Miss Orsett wrote it, and Mr. Penloe checked her, and Lavinia Pelham stood by the wall with her own book open on her arm. That is the part the parish could not get over afterwards, and it is the part that matters, so it must be told carefully. She had the book. She had had it since the 21st of October, when she stood at the corner of the kiln and wrote down every canister by the date on its lid as it went into the cart, and had added up the year's weights at the foot of the page, and had written the total in words before a single ounce of it had been out of her keeping. So, as Mr. Fladbury called each weight, she read out, before he called it, what it was going to be. "The 21st of September," said Mr. Fladbury, lifting the first canister. 15 ounces and 3/4, said Lavinia. The canister went on the pan. Mr. Fladbury put on the pound weight and took it off and put on the half and the quarter and 2 ounces and 1/4 ounce, and the arm swung and settled. 15 ounces and 3/4, said Mr. Fladbury, in a voice that had gone rather odd. "The 22nd, he said. 17 1/2. 17 1/2, the 23rd. 19 1/4. It was the best morning of the year. 19 1/4, said Mr. Fladbury. It took an hour and 10 minutes. Nobody left. 2 women came up from the village halfway through, because word had got down the lane that Miss Pelham was calling the weights before the steward, and they stood in the churchyard grass in the cold and watched a scale go up and down 40 times. The tarpaulin cart stood empty. Mr. Trantham carried, and sat down, and stood back, and carried the next. And by the 20th his face was running with sweat in November air, and he had stopped looking at anybody. And by the 30th there was not a soul in that churchyard who was enjoying it, which was, though nobody understood it at the time, precisely what she had intended. Because she never once raised her voice. She never once said a word about weeds. She stood by the wall in her mended gown with her book open and read out numbers, and every number was right, and the effect of it upon 41 people was something no speech in the world could have produced. At 25 minutes past 12, Mr. Fladbury set the last canister down. "That is the whole," he said. "Miss Orsett." "If you please, the total." Miss Tabitha Orsett, schoolmistress, added up a column of figures on a sheet of paper against a churchyard wall, with the whole parish watching her do it, which she said afterwards was the most frightening quarter of an hour of her life. And she added it twice, and she said, 640 ounces. And Lavinia Pelham turned her own book round and held it up so that the page could be seen, where it had been written in ink 18 days before, in a firm upright hand, in words and not in figures, 640 ounces. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Gedge, 70 years old, in the bonnet nobody had seen since the peace, said, "Well, of course it is," in the tone of a woman confirming that water is wet. And the churchyard of St. Botolph laughed, and went on laughing, and it was a different laugh altogether from the one 3 weeks before, and Mr. Halstock the churchwarden laughed hardest of anybody, and then had to turn round and blow his nose. Mr. Fladbury opened the manor roll on the flat stone, dipped a pen, and entered it, that on the 9th day of November in the year 1819, the crop of the close called Croker's 3 acres was weighed at the manor beam in the presence of the reeve and the constable of the parish, and found to be 640 ounces, and the same was restored entire to the tenant of the said close, Lavinia Pelham, spinster. "It wants a hand to it," said Mr. Fladbury, "besides mine." Mr. Silas Trantham took the pen. He wrote his name under the entry in a clear round hand that shook very slightly at the first letter, and not at all after it. and he added, without being asked and without looking up, the words, taken by me in error and by me restored. Then he put the pen down and looked at his own palms, which were black with the dust off the canister lids. Miss Pelham, he said, Sir, I shall say one thing and then I shall go, and I shall not trouble this parish again. I have been 11 years in Chelmsford, getting the name of a thorough man, and I got it honestly, and I have thrown a piece of it away in that room 3 weeks ago for the pleasure of making 26 people laugh at a young woman in an apron. There is no answer to that. I do not ask you to make one. I have one, though, said Lavinia. He waited. £264, she said, still stands against my father's estate. It does. Will you take it out of this, she said, and put her hand flat on the nearest canister. Not out of the ground, and not out of the estate, and not because any court has said I must, because no court has, and none will. Out of the crop, from me, today, in writing, and you may enter it as paid by the rector's daughter and close the account clean. My father was a mild man who could not keep a column, and he was very kind to me, and I do not want him going down in this parish as a clergyman who died owing a corn factor. It will take a little more than a fifth of the crop. I have a good deal more than a fifth of the crop. Mr. Bramwell, the curate, took off his spectacles and did not polish them. Miss Pelham, said Mr. Truntham, with great difficulty, I came here this morning expecting to be ruined by you. You are not worth ruining, said Lavinia, not unkindly. You are worth £264 and an entry in a roll. Mr. Penlow, will you draw it? Mr. Penlow, who had heard nothing about this beforehand, and who told the story for the remaining 9 years of his life, said that he would, and did, at the green baize table, in the vestry, with the parish looking through the door. Then 8 men carried 40 canisters of saffron up the lane to Kiln Cottage, and Mrs. Gedge went in front of them like a bishop's verger, and Miss Orsett walked beside Lavinia, with the sheet of paper still in her hand, and could not stop shaking. And the lean gentleman in the dark blue coat came out of the vestry last of all, put on his hat in the churchyard, said nothing whatever to anybody, exactly as he had promised, got on his horse, and rode away north towards the bridge. He had not spoken one word from 11 o'clock until 12:30. 9 separate people mentioned it that evening. 2 of them were annoyed about it. The rest of them, in the way of parishes, worked out for themselves over the following month what it had meant, and thought better of both of them for it. The house in Bucklersbury sent a man down on the 16th. He was a dry, careful person of about 40, who had spent his life among drugs and dyes, and who did not believe anything he had not smelt, and he opened 11 canisters at random on the table at Kiln Cottage, and drew the threads through his fingers, and crushed them, and put them on his tongue, and dropped a few in water and watched the colour go, and looked at them through a glass for stem, and for safflower, and for the marks of sugar, and at the end of an hour and a half he sat back, and said a thing that Miss Orsett wrote down that night in her own book, because she thought it ought to be kept. He said, Madam, I have been buying this article for 22 years, and I have not had 600 ounces of it out of England in my life, and I have never had any at all that was dried by somebody who understood that the fault is always the last half hour. He paid 5 guineas the pound weight, as agreed, without an attempt at the price, for 640 ounces, which is 40 pounds weight. And he took it away in a locked chest with a man on the box, and he left behind a proposal that the house should have the whole growth of the clothes for 3 years at the same figure, and a request, in a postscript, that Miss Pelham would consider selling them copies of the drying rules out of her book at any price she liked to name. She did not sell the rules. She wrote them out in 11 numbered paragraphs and gave them, and told him that a thing kept secret dies with the person keeping it, and that there had been 11 croakers in that parish when her great-aunt was a girl, and there was now one. £264 went to Mr. Trantham on the 18th, and the estate of the Reverend Hubert Pelham was closed clean in the December, with every creditor paid in full, and the corn factor at Bishop Stortford wrote a letter of thanks so warm that Mr. Penloe read it out twice. What was left, when the debt was paid, and the pickers were paid, and they were paid at a rate that made Mrs. Gedge sit down on a chair, came to something over £150. It was the largest sum Lavinia Pelham had ever had in her life. She spent £19 of it on new corms from a grower at Hinxton, £7 on the roof of the drying house, and £4 and some shillings on a second-hand beam scale of her own, so that she need never again ask anybody to tell her what a thing weighed. The rest she put in the funds, in her own name, at the bank at Bishop Stortford, and told nobody the figure, and never once afterwards mentioned it to her husband. The parish, meanwhile, did what parishes do, which is to rearrange itself quietly around a new fact and pretend it had always known. Mr. Halstock came up the lane on the first Sunday in Advent, in his good coat, and stood in the doorway of Kiln Cottage turning his hat over, and said that he had laughed in the vestry in October, and that he had been ashamed of it before the door shut, and that he had been 11 years asking her when to get his roots in, and had never once said thank you, and that he had brought a goose. "Mr. Halstock," said Lavinia, "I do not want a goose." "No," said Mr. Halstock, "but I want to have given you one," and she took the goose, and Mrs. Tetlow cooked it, and that was the end of it, and it was never spoken of between them again. Mrs. Tetlow herself, who had kept house at the rectory for 22 years, and had been out of a place since the March of the year before, was engaged in the January as housekeeper at Kiln Cottage, which had 2 rooms and a lean-to and did not need a housekeeper, on the frank understanding between the 2 of them that it did not, and Mrs. Tetlow ran it as though it were Hatfield. Miss Orsett shut the school for a second day in the spring, less improperly, and brought the whole of it up the lane in the July to watch the corms set at 4 inches, and the older girls were given a page each in a book, and told to write down what the weather did, and 11 of them kept it up past Christmas, and 2 of them kept it up for 30 years. And one of those 2 took the drying at Croker's 3 acres in the year 1843, when the mistress of it was in London, and could not be got home in time, and did not lose an ounce. And Mr. Fladbury, steward of the manor of Wendon Cray, wrote to his absent employer at Bath a letter of 11 pages, of which the middle 6 were about the beam, and received a reply of 2 lines saying that he did not perfectly follow, but that the manor was evidently in good hands and Mr. Fladbury might do as he thought best about the roof of the muniment room. Winter came in hard on the 4th of December. Lavinia had said on the 28th of November that it would come in before the 2nd Sunday in Advent, and had said it in the shop, to 4 people, without being asked, which was a thing she had never done before in her life, and afterwards she was rather cross with herself about it, and wrote in the book that night, under the weather, a single line that had nothing to do with the weather at all. It read, "I find I liked being right in public more than is good for me. Take care." She had reason to write it. A story that has been watched by 41 people does not stay the shape it was. By the middle of the December, the account current in the next parish, but one had a duke in it who had risen up in the vestry and struck the table, and by the January there was a version at Saffron Walden Market, in which the attorney had been made to carry the canisters barefoot, which nobody had ever suggested, and which delighted everybody who heard it. Lavinia put down every version she met, flatly, in the same words, that Mr. Trantham had acted upon a mistaken letter of her father's, that he had brought the crop entire and unsold when he might have sold it, that he had signed the entry in the roll with his own hand, and had added 5 words to it that nobody had required of him, and that the Duke of Harlestone had sat still throughout with his hands in his lap, and had not opened his mouth, and that anybody who said otherwise had not been there. She said it so often, and so exactly the same way each time, that by the spring the parish had given up embroidering it, which is the only way a parish ever does give it up. There came a Sunday in the January when Miss Orsett, who had been the schoolmistress at Netherwendon for 6 years, and had a mind that would not leave a thing alone, put down the book she was reading aloud from and said, "May I ask you something disagreeable?" "You may." "Would you have done it if he had been a poor man?" Lavinia put down her work. "No," she said. "No, if a poor man had taken my crop under a paper he believed in, I should have taken it back with a letter and never told anybody, because a poor man cannot afford to be looked at, and I could not have unlooked at him afterwards. Mr. Trantham can. He is an attorney of 11 years' standing, with a practice and a name and a house in Chelmsford, and he chose to spend a piece of that name on a joke about a woman in an apron in front of her neighbors to save himself the trouble of riding 2 miles. I made him buy it back at the price he had paid for it, and not 1 farthing more. I did not ruin him, and I would not have let anybody else ruin him. And I have thought about it a great deal, Tabitha, and I am satisfied it was just. And I am not at all satisfied that being satisfied is the same as being right." "That," said Miss Orsett, "is the least comfortable answer I have ever had from anybody. It is the only true one I have got." Mr. Halstock sent his boy up in the last week of the following September, as he had every year for 6 years, to ask when the roots ought to be got in. This time the boy came with a note, and the note was in the churchwarden's own laborious hand, and it did not ask. It said, if Mrs. Pelham would be so good as to say when, I should be obliged, and I will take it as a favour, and not as my right, having had it as my right for 6 years without knowing it. She sent back 4 words. Before Thursday week, please. He got them in on the Tuesday. The frost came on the Friday. The 12 acres took until the April. They lay immediately north of Croker's 3 acres, between the Close and the Ashton Road, and they had been in indifferent pasture for 30 years, because the manor could get nothing better out of them, and Lavinia had walked them in every month of every year since she was 17, and knew, as certainly as she knew the shape of her own hand, that the lie of them and the fall of them, and the fact that the water went off them east instead of standing, made them the best unplanted saffron ground between Walden and the Cam. She had written to the manor at Bath twice in the year 1818, and had been answered by a secretary, once in 3 lines, to the effect that Sir Hesketh Cray was not disposed to break up pasture. She wrote a 3rd time on the 2nd of December, 1819, and this time Mr. Fladbury sent his own letter with it. And Mr. Fladbury's letter set out the whole of the November business, the beam, the roll, the 117 entries, the 640 ounces, and the price got, and observed at the end that in his opinion the manor had for 11 years been drawing £6 a year in cottage rent from the only person in the county capable of doubling the value of its worst land, and that if his employer did not care to let her the 12 acres, somebody at Hinxton assuredly would. The lease came back signed on the 14th of April for 99 years, at 11 shillings the acre, with a covenant permitting kilns and a covenant against building anything else. Mr. Fladbury walked it up the lane himself for the 2nd time in his life, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand exactly as he had the 1st time. 99 years, he said. You will not see the end of it. No, said Lavinia. That is rather the point of 99 years. The 11 drying rules went out in the March. She had promised them to the house in Bucklersbury, and she sent them there first, written out fair, and then she sat down and considered, and then she did a thing that Mr. Penloway told her afterwards was either very foolish or very good business, and that he could not for the life of him decide which. She had copies made, and she sent them to the 3 men in England who were still growing the article for the market, one at Hinxton, one in Suffolk, and an old gentleman near Walden who had 11 perches of it in his garden, and had not sold an ounce in 9 years, and to the Physic Garden at Chelsea, and to a lady in Norfolk who had written to her out of the blue in the August asking how deep to set. To the lady in Norfolk she added a page in her own hand which said, in substance, that the writer might have all the rules for nothing but should understand that the rules were not the crop, that the crop was 52 years of a book, and that if she meant to do it she should begin the book this October and never miss a week, not for illness, not for Christmas, and not for a wedding. She did not know, when she wrote that sentence, that she was quoting a dying old woman word for word. She found it out in the following December, when she read the register through, and it upset her more than anything in the whole of that year had done. The pickers were paid in the 1st week of December. There had never been a written rate at Croker's 3 acres. Her great-aunt had paid what she thought right, and Lavinia had paid the same, and the same was 8 a morning and a quart of beer, which was the parish rate for women's work, and had been since before the war. That December Lavinia paid 1 shilling and 6pence a morning, and a shilling extra for every morning a woman had come before it was light, and she paid Mrs. Gedge £4 over and above in a paper, and she called it what it was, which was 52 years of teaching 2 Pelhams their trade. Mrs. Gedge looked at the paper for some time. This is too much, she said. It is not enough, said Lavinia, and you know quite well it is not. And you also know that if I gave you what it was worth, you would give it to your daughter's husband, who drinks. So I have given you what I can make you keep. You are a hard young woman. I am your young woman, said Lavinia, and I have been since I was 15, and did not know the top of a corn from the bottom, and you never once let me be laughed at in this parish, not one single time in 11 years, not even when I deserved it. Take the money, Sabine. It was the only time in the whole of their acquaintance that either of them used the other's given name, and neither of them ever did it again. There was one more piece of business out of that autumn, and it did not come to anything for 2 years, and then came to a great deal. In the July of 1821, Mr. Silas Trantham, attorney, of Chelmsford, wrote to Mr. Penlow, of Bishop's Stortford, about an estate at Witham, in which a widow had been told by her late husband's family that a piece of ground she had worked for 9 years was theirs. He wrote that he had been offered the executorship and had declined it, and had recommended that the widow be advised to search the manor roll before she agreed to anything, and had told her, in terms, that he had once been very sure of a thing of that kind, and had been made to carry 40 canisters across a churchyard for it, and that he had found the exercise instructive and did not recommend it. He added a postscript: "You may show this letter to her Grace if you think proper. I do not ask her to answer it." Mr. Penlow showed it to her at Nether Wendon, in the August, in the drying house, while 3 kilns were being got ready, and 19 women were setting up the chiving tables under the new roof. Lavinia read it twice and gave it back. "Put it in the box," she said with the other one. That winter she read her great-aunt's register through, from beginning to end, all 41 years of it, at the rate of a year an evening, with Mrs. Tetlow knitting on the other side of the hearth and Miss Orsett coming up on Sundays to be read at. She had used it for 11 years the way a person uses an almanac, opening it at the month she wanted and shutting it again. She had never once sat down and read it as a book. It is a strange thing to read 41 Octobers in a row. The weather repeats and does not repeat. The same 6 places, in the same 3 acres, run warm and cold and warm again. A woman gets old in the margins, the hand is round and careful in 1767, and cramped and quick in 1805, and in the last 2 years it goes large and shaky and the entries get shorter, and the very last of them, in the September of 1808, says only, "Ground, opened, cannot go down. Sent Sally, she will do." And in among the weather, 3 or 4 times a year, there was something that was not weather. In 1789, the boy came down again all week. He has the hands for it. His father will not have him at the kiln, and I have told him so, and we have quarrelled. In 1794, H. ordained. I did not go. I should have gone. In 1802, H. married. She is a pleasant, sensible woman, with a great deal of sense about ground, of all things, and asked me the right questions, and I was short with her because I had determined beforehand to be, and came home and was ashamed. In 1806, the child was brought down. 6 years old, stood at the chiving table 40 minutes without fidgeting, and counted the flowers into the basket by tens. I said nothing to her father. There is no sense in starting it again. Lavinia sat with that one open on her knee for a long time. She had been told all her life, by her father, gently, and always in the same words, that his aunt had been a hard woman who had cared for nothing but a field. She had believed it in the way children believe the weather of the house they grow up in, and here in a marbled book was 41 years of a woman who had quarrelled with a boy she was fond of about what he was to do with his hands, and had lost, and had been too proud to mend it, and had watched a 6-year-old count flowers by tens, and had said nothing about it for 9 years, and had then sent for her when she was dying and given her the book. She copied out 4 of the entries and sent them to nobody. She wrote in her own register that night, "I have had 2 great aunts all my life, and did not meet the second until this December, 11 years after her funeral. The Duke of Harlestone came back into the parish on the 21st of December. He had gone to Northamptonshire in the middle of November, 4 days after the weighing, and had stayed away 5 weeks, which the parish thought very odd, and which Lavinia thought was the single best-mannered thing anybody had ever done for her. Because if he had come up the lane in the week after the 9th, with the whole village warm and talking, every soul in Nether Vendon would have made one story out of 2, and she would have spent the rest of her life being the young woman whose grand friend came and settled it. He waited until it had gone cold and dull and nobody was talking about anything, and then he came on a wet Tuesday when there was nothing whatever to see. He asked at the door whether he might come in, and was told that he might, and sat in the one chair that had arms, in a cottage with 2 rooms in it, with his boots wet, and Mrs. Tetlow made a great deal of noise in the lean to with the door open. In June he said, "You told me I might have the rest of your reasons at Michaelmas if I still wanted them. It is past Michaelmas. It is nearly Christmas. I have been counting since the 29th of September and telling myself that October was what you meant, and then that November was what you meant, and I have run out of months. I want them." "You had 4 in June," said Lavinia. 3 of them are gone." "Which 3? "You have known me 8 months and not 11 weeks. You have been away 3 times and come back 3 times, and I have watched what you are like when you are bored, which is the only useful thing to know about a man. And I have had my October, and it is over, and it was the best I have ever had, and I can think about something else now." "And the 4th? She was quiet. "The 4th was that I did not know what you would do if I were in trouble," she said. "I know now. You sat on a bench with your hands in your lap for an hour and a half and let a parish watch you not help me. I have thought about that a great deal more than I have thought about anything you have ever said to me. Most men would rather be useful than obeyed. I very nearly stood up twice." "I know," said Lavinia. "I could see the back of your neck." The Duke of Harlestone got up out of the chair with arms and stood in the middle of a room in which a tall man could not stand in the middle without stooping, and did it anyway. "Miss Pelham," he said, "I had not, when I rode into this parish in the March to look at a broken bridge, expected any of this. I have loved you with what dignity I could manage, and with what patience your year required, since the 14th of April, when you did not look up. I am asking now, on no other ground, than that I have loved you without variation since that morning, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. You have known me 8 months, and I shall not press you to be in love with me on that acquaintance. I ask only that you consider it in your own time, and answer me on your own terms. If your answer is no, the friendship stands exactly as it is, and the proposal shall never be raised again." "Your Grace," said Lavinia Pelham, "I shall." There was a pause of about 2 seconds, which he afterwards said was the longest of his life. "You might," he said, "have taken your own time." "I have had 5 weeks of it," said Lavinia, "while you were in Northamptonshire being tactful. Sit down. You will do yourself an injury on that beam." They were married on the 11th of February, 1820, in the parish church of St. Botolph at Nether Vendon, after banns read on 3 Sundays by the Reverend Mr. Bramwell, who got through the first Sunday, made a hash of the second because he was crying, and did the third perfectly. There was some correspondence first, of course. A duke of 36, who proposes to marry the daughter of a dead country rector, who grows a crop with her own hands, generally has a great deal of correspondence. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, came down from Northamptonshire in the January to look at her, and came without warning, which was deliberate, and found her at the chiving table in an apron, with her hands stained to the wrist, teaching 2 girls of 13 and 15 how to strip a flower without breaking the thread. The Dowager Duchess of Harlestone was 71, and had buried a husband she had been fond of and a husband's agent she had not, and she sat down on the bench by the door without being asked, and watched for 11 minutes. Then she said, "How much is it worth, the crop?" £200 this year, said Lavinia, and it will not be that again for 3 years, because the price is high on account of the war, and the war is over. You know that, do you? Anybody knows that who reads the prices. I shall get 4 guineas next year and 3 the year after, and then it will settle at something under 2, and by then I shall have doubled the ground, because the price of the article does not signify a quarter as much as the weight of it, and there is no ground in this county so fit for it as the 12 acres lying next to mine, and they belong to the manor, and I have written to Bath about them twice. The Dowager Duchess of Harlestone looked at her for a while. My son, she said, is a serious man who has been very much alone and has been hunted for 7 years by mothers with prettier daughters than you, and has come home from every season of it looking like a horse that has been kept standing in the rain. What are you going to do with him? Keep the register with him, said Lavinia. He has 400 tenants, and not one of them writes anything down. He asked me in April whether there were 50 books like mine in England. There are perhaps 9. In 20 years there ought to be 400, and there is exactly 1 man in this country with the land and the patience and the temper to make it happen, and I intend to be extremely useful to him, and he is not to be told that this was ever a reason, because it was not the first one, and it was not the second. You are not in the least what I came down here to find, said the Dowager Duchess. No, ma'am. I came to find a sly girl with a field, said the old woman, getting up, and I have found a woman who has read the price of saffron for 11 years, and can tell me what the Spanish trade will do when the peace beds in. You will want a decent gown to be married in, and you will not buy one, out of principle, and it will be the wrong sort of principle. So I shall send you one, and you will wear it, and we shall say no more about it. She sent it on the 2nd of February. It was a heavy cream silk with no ornament on it at all, made by a woman in Northampton, and it fitted, because Mrs. Tetlow had sent the measurements without telling anybody, and Lavinia wore it, and said no more about it, and it hung in a press at Harlestone for 41 years afterwards, and was worn twice more, once by a daughter and once by a granddaughter. There was one difficulty in the January, and it was not with the Dowager Duchess, and it was not with the parish, and it very nearly was not settled at all. It was with the settlement. A marriage between a duke and a rector's daughter of no fortune is drawn by men in London who have drawn 11 such settlements before, and who know exactly what the instrument ought to say. And what the instrument ordinarily says is that everything the lady brings comes in, and everything she has is thereafter administered by trustees for her benefit and her husband's. And that is that, and it is meant kindly, and it is generally accepted without a word. The draft came down to Bishop Stortford on the 9th of January. Mr. Penloway read it in his office, and then put on his coat and hired a gig, and came to Nether Wendon the same afternoon in weather that a man of 65 had no business being out in. "There is nothing dishonest in it," he said, standing in the doorway of Kiln Cottage, dripping. "I want that said first. There is nothing in this that any gentleman's lawyer would think twice about, but by the 4th clause, on the day you marry him, the close called Croker's 3 acres, the drying house upon it, the lease of the 12 acres, and the whole growth of both go to the trustees of the Harlestone estate, and thereafter you hold them as the trustees permit. And if you and he should quarrel about how the ground is worked, the ground is theirs and not yours, and the 99-year lease is in his name and not yours, and the entry at the manor beam at Michaelmas would be made in his name and not yours. It is the ordinary form. It is also in your particular case, and I say this as a man who has read your grant 11 times, the exact thing that Mr. Trantham attempted in October, done properly, by consent, and with a wedding at the end of it." Lavinia read it through twice at the table with her hands flat on either side of the paper. Then she said, "Will you write to him for me, or shall I? You had far better let me." "No," she said. "He would rather have it from me, and I would rather he had it from me, and if he takes it badly I would rather know that now than in 11 years. She wrote that evening. The letter is at Harlestone, and has been read by 5 generations, and the material part of it is 4 sentences long. "I will marry you on any terms you like as to money, of which I have none that signifies and want none. I will not marry you on any terms whatever by which the 3 acres cease to stand in my own name at the manor of Wendon Cray. My great-great-grandfather bought that close for £40 in the year 1698, and the rent has been entered in the name of a Pelham 117 times, and 11 weeks ago I stood in a churchyard and made a man weigh out 640 ounces to establish it, and I did not do that in order to sign it away in February to a man I love. Send me a settlement that says the close and the lease and the growth of both are mine, in my own name, in my own hand, to my own use, and I will sign it, on my knees." The Duke of Harlestone received that letter in Northamptonshire on the 11th, at breakfast, in front of his mother. According to the Dowager Duchess, who told the story with great enjoyment for the remaining 9 years of her life, he read it once and laughed out loud, and read it again and stopped laughing, and then got up and went out of the room without saying anything, and was found 40 minutes later in the estate office, with the draft settlement on the desk in front of him, and a pen in his hand, striking out the 4th clause and writing in the margin, in his own hand, a new one. He sent it back by his own man who rode, and it reached Bishop Stortford on the 13th. The new clause provided that the close called Croker's 3 acres in the parish of Nether Wendon, the drying house thereon, the way the Retto, the lease of the 12 acres adjoining, and the whole growth, produce, and profits of the same should remain the sole and separate property of Lavinia Pelham after her marriage as fully as before it, free from the control and free from the debts of her husband, and that the yearly rent of 1 ounce should continue to be rendered, and entered in the roll of the manor in her own name, and that if the estate of Harlestone should ever, by any accident, come to be answerable for a debt of any kind, the said close and lease should not be answerable for 1 penny of it. At the foot of the draft, where a man usually writes nothing at all, the 5th Duke of Harlestone had written a note to his own lawyers. You will tell me this is irregular. It is. Draw it. She is not bringing me a fortune, and she is not bringing me a connection. She is bringing me the only piece of land in England that has been kept properly for 121 years, and I am not such a fool as to put my name on it. Mr. Penlow read that note aloud in the kitchen at Kiln Cottage, with Mrs. Tetlow present. And Mrs. Tetlow, who had kept house for a clergyman for 22 years, and had opinions about the gentry that she had never once expressed, sat down on the settle and said, well, and then said nothing else for a quarter of an hour. Lavinia signed it on the 20th of January, at the green baize table in the vestry of St. Botolph, because the vestry was where the parish did business and she was not going to begin doing hers anywhere else, and Mr. Bramwell and Mr. Fladbury witnessed it, and the banns were read for the first time on the Sunday following. The wedding was at 10:30 in the morning, and it was the plainest wedding a duke had made in that county in living memory, and the parish would not have had 1 word of it altered. There were no carriages down from London. There was no breakfast at a great house, because the great house was in Northamptonshire and the bride had declined to be married out of her own parish. The church was full an hour before the time, and there were people in the porch and people on the path, and a good many along the churchyard wall, and Mr. Halstock and Mr. Preble, as churchwardens, had the doors, and the constable, Job Curtis, wore his staff for the 2nd time in 4 months, and was as pleased about it as he had been in November. Mr. Penlow of Bishop's Stortford, 65, in a plain black coat and gold-rimmed spectacles, gave her away, having been asked in a letter of 4 lines, and having replied by return in 11 pages, of which 10 were law and 1 was not. Mrs. Gedge, who was 70, and who had picked on those 3 acres since she was 9 years old, sat in the 3rd pew from the front on the bride's side, with 5 of the pickers, in the bonnet. Mr. Fladbury, steward of the manor, came with the abstract of the roll in his coat pocket, for no reason whatever except that he could not bring himself to leave it at home. Mr. Silas Trantham, attorney, of Chelmsford, was invited. He came. He sat at the back, on the end of the bench nearest the door, in a dark waistcoat, and shook hands with nobody and left before the bells, and wrote afterwards from Chelmsford a letter of 1 sentence, which said, I am very glad to have been there, and I remain, Madame, your obliged and humbled servant. Lavinia kept it in the japanned box with the grant, where it is still. Miss Tabitha Orsett shut the school for the 3rd and last time. The Reverend Mr. Bramwell married them, and did it beautifully and did not cry. And afterwards, when the 2 of them came out of the south door into a hard, bright February morning with the whole parish along the path from the porch to the Lick Gate, the bride did a thing that nobody had arranged, and that Mrs. Tetlow, who had arranged everything else, had known nothing about. She stopped on the flat stone by the south door, where the manor beam had stood in November, and she looked down at it for perhaps 3 seconds, and then she went on. That was all. Half the parish did not see it. The half that did saw it for the rest of their lives. They went to Northamptonshire in the March, and the new Duchess of Harlestone spent 5 weeks going over 400 tenancies with her husband and a clerk and a map, and at the end of it she said that the estate was honest, badly written down, and 11 years behind where it might be, and that she proposed to begin with the 4 home farms and a book each. They came back into Essex in the July for the setting. That was the arrangement they made in the first month of the marriage and never afterwards altered. That from the middle of July to the middle of November the Duke and Duchess of Harlestone were in the parish of Nether Wendon, in a house of no distinction at all, a quarter of a mile from the church which he bought that spring, and she refused to have altered beyond a new roof and a proper drying house, and that Croker's 3 acres, and the 12 acres next to it, which the manor let to her in the April on a lease of 99 years, were worked by her in an apron, with her own hands and 11 women, and by the 3rd season a good deal of the parish school. She kept the register. He kept one too, badly at first, and she told him so. And he improved. On the 29th of September in the year 1820, at the manor beam in the yard at Wendon Cray, in the presence of the reeve and the constable of the parish, Mr. Fladbury weighed 1 ounce of good dried saffron of the growth of the close called Croker's 3 acres, and entered it in the roll of the manor in the name of the tenant. And the name he entered was Lavinia, Duchess of Harlestone. She had walked it over herself on foot 2 miles in a plain gown, as she had done every year since she was 16. Mr. Fladbury, who by then knew better than to offer, had the beam ready, and the pen wet, and the entry half written before she came into the yard. Her husband rode with her as far as the turn of the lane, and no further, at her request, which she made once, and never had to make again. The crop of 1820 came to 491 ounces off the old ground, the new 12 acres being not yet in bearing, and it fetched 4 guineas the pound, exactly as she had told the Dowager Duchess it would, and the crop of 1821 came to 930 ounces, and fetched 3. And the crop of 1824, when the new ground was in full bearing and there were 3 kilns on the hill and 19 women at the chiving tables, came to 2,416 ounces, which was more saffron than had been dried in the county of Essex in any 1 year since the reign of Queen Anne, and it fetched under 2 guineas, and she had said it would, and it did not signify, because the weight had quadrupled, and the parish had 11 households in it that were living on the flour. 1 year and 8 months after the wedding, on the cool, clear morning of the 23rd of October, 1821, their first child, a daughter, christened Thomasine Anne Devereux, was baptized at the parish church of St. Botolph at Nether Wendon by the Reverend Mr. Bramwell, with Miss Tabitha Orsett standing as godmother and Mr. Penlow of Bishop Stortford as godfather, and the christening was put off by 4 days from the date first appointed, because the flower came early that year and her mother would not leave the kiln. And Miss Bramwell said from the pulpit on the Sunday following that he had waited on a good many things in his ministry, and never before on a crocus, and that he hoped the child would grow up to understand what a compliment had been paid her. She did. Thomasine Devereux took the drying at Croker's 3 acres in her 19th year, and kept the register in her own hand for 52 years after her mother's death, and it is her writing, not her mother's, that fills the 11th and 12th of the marbled books. There are stories that begin with a kiss, There are stories that begin with a vow, and stories that begin with a knock at a door in the middle of the night, and stories that begin with a hired postchaise turning in at a strange gate, and stories that begin with a letter 18 years sealed. And there are, slower than those, longer in the proving, and of a much more patient kind in the asking, stories that begin with a woman of 15 being handed an empty book by a dying old lady who tells her that memory is a flatterer and ink is not, and who is right, and who is proved right 11 years afterwards on a flat stone outside a church door in front of 41 people, 1 ounce at a time. Lavinia, Duchess of Harlestone, died at Netherwenden in the autumn of 1872, in her 80th year 4 days after the last picking, having missed 1 week of the register in 53 years, and having noted in the margin of that week the reason, which was her husband's funeral. The books are 17 in number. They are kept, with a sheet of vellum bearing a red seal, in a black japanned box. And so, on the cold bright morning of the 11th of February, 1820, in the parish church of St. Botolph at Netherwenden in the county of Essex, under a hard blue Essex sky, Miss Lavinia Pelham, who had stood in a mended grey gown at the end of a green baize table, and heard herself told before her neighbours that she had 3 acres of weeds, and no more notion of husbandry than the crocus has of chancery, and who had said nothing, and had gone home, and had turned the haircloth, and had then required the man who said it to carry her crop into the daylight, and weigh out 640 ounces of it with his own hands in front of the whole parish, became, by the patient asking of the 5th Duke of Harlestone, who had sat through the whole of it, with his hands in his lap, because she had asked him to, the mistress of Croker's 3 acres, the Duchess of Harlestone, and the last and by a long way the greatest of the Crokers of Netherwenden.